All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley Nunes. I am the director for R Street's competition policy program. R Street is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. Our mission is to engage in meaningful policy research and outreach that promotes free markets and limited effective government. We are dedicated to building broad coalitions and working with a wide variety of groups who share our public policy goals. We work extensively on both state and national policy and focus on issues that other groups tend to neglect. Our specialty is tackling issues that are complex but don't necessarily grab major headlines. That said, today, we will be discussing a topic that has been in the headlines, the Child Tax Credit, or CTC. Introduced with bipartisan support and signed into law by President Bill Clinton in 1997, the CTC provides income support to households with children. Since its introduction, the program has undergone numerous changes that have dramatically expanded how much assistance American families can receive, and perhaps more pertinent to our conversation today, which Americans can receive that assistance. Most recently, in 2021, the CTC was expanded, albeit temporarily, by President Joe Biden, a move that has been praised and criticized in equal measure. Today, we have assembled a talented and respected panel that will examine and discuss various aspects of the CTC, its efficacy, and what its future, if any, should look like. This morning's event is part of a series R Street is hosting on the CTC. The second event will be held at 1 p.m. this afternoon, and I encourage you all to tune in for that as well. We are especially grateful to the Robin Hood Foundation for making this conversation possible. During our panel, please take advantage of the chat function to share comments and join the conversation. We have reserved time for questions at the end of the session. If you have questions, please do send those through using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the event, we will be posting the recording on our website and R Street's YouTube channel. Today's conversation coincides with the preprint server release of our report on the CTC, its history, legislative changes, and distributional impact. The report, which is linked on our website, documents compelling, consistent, and clear evidence of inequities in benefits realization. We find that married couples are better positioned to claim the full benefit as are single fathers compared to single mothers. More broadly, we find that when it comes to claiming the CTC, it pays to be married, particularly if the claim's beneficiary is female. Our report proposes ways to address this inequity while preserving what is arguably the most contentious part of the CTC program, namely the work requirement. That requirement and other aspects of the CTC are what we hope to tackle today through vigorous debate. So without further delay, let me introduce this morning's panel. Oren is Executive Director at American Compass. He was previously a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is the author of The Once and Future Worker. Samuel Hammond is the Director of Poverty and Welfare Studies at the Niskanen Center. He previously worked as an economist for the Government of Canada, specializing in rural economic development. Elaine Maag is a Senior Fellow at the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Before Urban, she worked at the IRS and GAO as a Presidential Management Fellow. Scott Winship is the Director of Poverty Studies and a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of The Conservative Case Against a Child Allowance and previously served as the Executive Director of the Joint Economic Committee. A sincere thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Before we dive into what the CTC should look like, probably a good place to start is to ask whether Americans need a child tax credit. Elaine, do we need a child tax credit?
So in some sense, when we have things like child tax credits in the budget, it represents a value that we have. And so if we value children, we ought to be willing to support them. The second reason that's more pressing, though, is we know from a long line of research that children who grow up in poverty have a lot of worse outcomes over their lifetime. They are less likely to do well in school. They are less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to get a high-paying job later on, more likely to interact with the criminal justice system, more likely to interact with the welfare system later. And so if we can do something to prevent that from happening early on, it seems to me a worthy goal. So I would say yes, we should have a child tax credit or some other broad-based child benefit.
Oop, you're muted, Ashley, I think.
There we go. If I may just stay with you for a second, Elaine, you have previously also talked about the importance of the CTC and specifically within the context of it being a child poverty alleviation measure. You said the following in a report, as you correctly point out, it's a recognition that it's not your child's fault if you're not working, and your child is most definitely the one who suffers if you don't have income.
Right, so I think we have this policy conversation that focuses a lot on moms, sometimes on the family, and we ought to be thinking about the child. So we can do as many punitive things as we want to try to get people to behave in certain ways, to get mothers to work a certain number of hours, to have both parents working, anything like that. But in the end, it's the child that pays for the actions that happen. So we, bluntly, sometimes we say we swing for the mother and hit the child instead. And I think in all of these conversations, we ought to be centering, what is best for the child. So if getting support into a household is good for children, that ought to be where we put our focus.
Okay, Oren, if I may turn to you. You, based on some of your writings, seem to feel differently. In 2021, you and your colleagues said the following: the policy may be a child benefit insofar as it is calculated based on the number of children a family has, but it is paid to a parent and spent as the parent sees fit. The poverty threshold at issue is the households. One might just as accurately describe the goal as ending parent poverty, which tug less effectively at the heartstrings. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I think it's, from my perspective, a little frustrating to see the child tax credit discussion be converted into an anti-poverty discussion. I think even in your introduction, Ashley, you sort of described it as an income support and assistance. And obviously we're starting out on this discussion of how to combat child poverty. That's not what the child tax credit is or was. Certainly when it was passed on a bipartisan basis, it was part of the tax code and a reduction in tax liability for working families, right? You can think what you want about tax credits, the mortgage deduction, anything else, but we don't call those income support or assistance. They are provisions of the tax code for people who pay taxes. And so, I think we can do better. I think one problem with the way it's structured is that relatively low income households therefore receive less than high income households, which I don't think makes sense. And certainly we can get into the question of, how best to structure something that reaches and benefits working and even lower income households as effectively as possible. But as soon as we sort of switch the discussion and talk instead about how to help children in poverty, first of all, I think we're doing a real disservice to all of the working and middle class parents and families who are rightfully the target of the child tax credit and benefit from its strong bipartisan support. And I think we're also just fundamentally misunderstanding and thinking wrong about anti-poverty policy. The reality is, at the end of the day, that I think, fortunately, the family is the relevant economic unit that we think about in this country. And we want to lift families up, and we recognize that it's the obligation of a family to care for and raise children. And so the question is how to help move families out of poverty. There was a time when we thought just sending everybody money would be the way to do that. But after a very long debate, I think we rightfully concluded that that's not the right answer. So I certainly think we should have a robust discussion about how best to combat child poverty. But I think it's a real mistake to confuse that with the question of how to support working families.
Thanks, Oren. It actually, your sentiment reminds me a little of a piece I think that Senator Rubio had recently in the National Review, where he said, if solving poverty was as easy as sending everyone a check, then we would have solved poverty a long time ago. Sam?
Well, it's certainly true that just giving people money isn't the total solution to poverty or panacea. However, it's hard to deny when you look cross-sectionally that the reason the U.S. stands out in its elevated rate of child poverty is the dearth of child benefits. So there are many reasons why you might want a child tax credit, some more technocratic than others, some more symbolic. Preserving choice and flexibility in how parents afford childcare is a big one. Recognizing the contribution of caregivers and the value of home production above and beyond the value of working outside the household is another one. There's also this sort of insurance value, or you can think of it in terms of liquidity events if you want to get very technocratic. There's a tendency in DC policy debates to focus on the income distribution as if it were static, when in fact people move in and out of poverty all the time. And there are a fraction who we think of as being the intergenerationally poor. But often, if you're in the bottom quintile of income, you're a student, you're retired, you are, what I was in grad school, broke, not poor. And often these correlate with when people have their first children, because we don't control our biology, and we tend to have kids in our 20s and early 30s, and earnings only peak later in life. And so one of the big reasons why 108 countries around the world have some form of a national periodic child benefit in their legislation is in recognition both of the intrinsic value of ensuring every kid has the resources to succeed, but also recognizing that the market on its own does not redistribute resources on the basis of how many dependents you have in your household.
So Sam, you picked up on effectively what my next question was for Scott, which is specifically directed towards the assertion that raising a family is pricey, and that there are financial considerations parents think about before they have children. Scott, in a recent report, you said the following. You said, the extent to which financial constraints limit families' ability to have children and balance work and family has been overstated. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I think there are a number of reasons that folks give for justifying the child tax credit, and I'm probably lukewarm to most of them. The one that maybe bothers me the most is the idea that it's become too expensive to raise a family, not for the poor, but for the middle class, and for everybody generally. And I think that just is in direct disagreement with the facts. A couple of people are running for Senate. J.D. Vance had a good night last night. Blake Masters in Arizona saying that you ought to be able to raise a family on one income and that you can't do that anymore. In fact, men's earnings, including the earnings of 20-something men, is as high as it's ever been. When people talk about fertility trends, and it's undisputable that fertility has declined over time by a lot. That's happened throughout the rich world, by the way. But in the United States, it's often asserted that decline has been because people can no longer afford to have the number of kids that they want to have. Therefore, we need a child tax credit for the middle class and the upper middle class to alleviate that, and so that more people can have a stay-at-home parent. Rarely is actual data, sort of brought into these kinds of assertions. And so last year, I used a couple of surveys that started out by interviewing teenagers, and then it followed them over time. And for both of those surveys, we're able to look at women in their mid-30s. And you can actually compare how many kids they have in their mid-30s to how many kids they said they expected to have or wanted as teenagers and young adults. Turns out that hasn't changed over time. If anything, it looks like more people, more women rather than fewer, have been able to have the number of kids they want by their mid-30s. There are some projections that suggest that maybe we've already hit a high watermark and that Gen Z is going to have a more difficult time. Those are projections. In the past, the same kinds of projections have understated completed fertility down the road. Completed fertility can fall because unintended pregnancy and unintended births fall, which is generally regarded as a good thing. So there's really little basis for thinking that it's become more expensive to raise a family, and attempts to do that, I think, are just deeply flawed.
So if I may ask a follow-up. So the assertion effectively is that if you are seeing declining fertility, a small percentage of the reason why is because of financial considerations?
I mean, there's not super rigorous research that's able to tease that apart, but what is certainly the case is people are able to have as many kids. They come as close to reaching their fertility goals as they ever did, and more people fall short of their fertility goals than overshoot their fertility goals. But that hasn't gotten worse over time, so I think, around the rich world, fertility has declined. I think it mostly reflects that the things that people want these days has changed. We want more stuff. We want bigger houses. We have bigger houses on the order of 50% bigger than what they were, say, in the early 1970s. And part of that is we want fewer kids, and we want to marry later in life. We want to have more fulfilling careers, and those all entail trade-offs. And I think too often social conservatives in particular sort of wish or would like to think that preferences haven't changed, that they remain the way that they were in this nostalgic era of the 1950s. And so they convince themselves that the preferences haven't changed. It's just become harder to fulfill them. And I just don't think that there's any evidence for that.
So if we think about the CTC, of course, it's become what many people see as being an anti-poverty tool. Oren has, of course, talked earlier a little bit about why it perhaps should not be seen in that light. But Elaine, if I could start with you, in an interview you gave last year, you said the following, and you were talking about the CTC within the context of the pandemic. You said, even after the pandemic ends, we will still have a child poverty rate that's typically a little bit over 14%. But if we keep the expanded child tax credit, which was part of the ARP that has now since expired, we could drop the child poverty rate down closer to about 8%. Does the CTC reduce poverty?
So this is work that my colleagues, Greg Hutch and Kevin Werner did using a market simulation model where they essentially said in a normal year, so not in a year that's affected by lots of job loss or lots of economic impact payments going to your household, what does the child tax credit do for families, for low-income families? And what they said is it reduces poverty from a rate of about 14% to 8.5%. And that is lifting about 4.3 million children out of poverty. But of course, the CTC does more than that, right? It's not just an anti-poverty tool. And as Oren points out, it's a benefit that goes to a lot of families. So we've also done research that shows not only is the CTC reducing poverty, but it's also in that expanded form was helping even relatively high income families. So solidly middle income families, $75,000 earnings or so, are reporting they're using the child tax credit to pay down debt and to pay off bills and to meet monthly needs. That's more likely in Hispanic and Black communities, which sort of reflects some disadvantages in the labor market that have been somewhat persistent. So yeah, it does reduce poverty, and it also provides a benefit for middle income families.
Elaine, if I could just follow up on the comment you made about the disproportionate impact or the disproportionate concentration that we see for child poverty in communities of color specifically. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
What the research shows?
Yeah, so I think the numbers are pretty clear. If you are Black or Hispanic, you're more likely to be in poverty than if you're white. There's more white people in poverty, but that's a function of the distribution of the population. So when the child tax credit is in its current form, that it phases in, it has a maximum benefit for how much can be received as a refund. It essentially leaves 27 million children out of the full benefit. Those children are more likely to be Black or Hispanic. That's work by Jacob Golden and Kathy Mickelmore, as well as work that I did with Bob Greenstein, who used to be at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So policies that don't have a work requirement, that instead provide that full benefit to even very low income families, can work to undo some of the disadvantages that we see in a typical year.
Okay. So just staying with the idea that the CTC reduces poverty, Oren, you've been quite vocal about this. You've said perhaps the most popular argument for a generous program of family support is that it will reduce child poverty. Cash payments achieve it, sending families more money than the poverty thresholds for families of their size would, by mathematical identity, reduce poverty. Sufficiently generous checks might reduce the federal government's official calculation of the poverty rate to 0, but that measure is an abstract data point. Why?
Well, it is, right? I mean, if you're kind of talking about the micro simulation that Elaine's doing, you're literally taking the incomes of lots of people, you're adding the child tax credit value to it, and you're asking if now it has gone from below a threshold to above a threshold. And you find some set of families for who it does, and you declare that a reduction in poverty. And I want to be clear, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think getting money to low income households is terrific. And the fact that they will have more income and resources as a result is a good thing. I just think we have to be very careful again when we frame this in terms of a poverty fighting tool, both for substantive and political reasons. And the substantive reason is that you've now lifted this household's income, let's say, from below the poverty line to above the poverty line. But at the end of the day, the reasons that we're concerned about poverty are certainly in one part resources, but they're certainly not exclusively a function of resources. We're concerned about for kids especially, the family situations that they're living in, the opportunities that they are going to have. And so if we say, well, we've sent them a check, so we've cured child poverty, I think we're almost sort of giving ourselves a get out of jail free card. And we did a survey on this question at American Compass. We just asked people straightforwardly, if you give people more money to move them from below the poverty line to above the poverty line, has the government done a good job reducing poverty? Or the alternative being, yes, we should try to get more resources to households, but reducing poverty means getting them up on their own feet when they can be supporting themselves. And overwhelming majorities choose the latter. Obviously independents and Republicans, working class households in particular, more than 2/3 would say that this isn't actually reducing poverty. Striking thing is only even among Democrats, you get barely over 50% buying this as sort of the way to reduce poverty. And so, I think there's an enormous middle ground here for compromise that could find bipartisan support, which says absolutely we should get these resources to these lower income households. As Elaine said, when you have the phase in, when it's so closely tied to tax liability, you can't get the most resources to the people who most need the resources. I think where an important line gets drawn, certainly on the right of center, and I'd say broadly for American attitudes, is whether you're going to include people who aren't working at all. And that's something that the left has drawn a very hard line on and said, even if no one in the household is working and there's no income, we need to send this benefit to those households as well. I think substantively that's a mistake. Unsurprisingly, it's politically very unpopular. And by the way, we should keep in mind that technically doesn't lift anyone out of poverty, because if we're playing this mathematical game of drawing a threshold and getting people over it, the child tax credit is not large enough to get a zero income family over the poverty line anyway. So I would love to see broader agreement on this idea that yes, there does have to be connection to work. Once we've established that connection, let's try to be as generous as we can. And then let's absolutely try to find ways to help households that aren't working at all, but let's not suggest that just sending them money is the way that we're going to do that.
So speaking of whether or not a household has any income, Sam, I think in some of your work with your colleagues, you have talked a little bit about appreciating some of the income shocks that households experience, and there might be very good reasons for why people actually aren't working in a household. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, when you talk about the non-workers in America, taking everybody of all ages, about 45% are children, about a quarter are the elderly or retired. There's about 9% that are disabled, 6 or 7% that are students. As you start to trim this down, only about 1.2% of non-working Americans don't fall into one of those categories. They are able-bodied, they could be working, but they aren't. And that's a problem. Often, I think in these discussions, we can conflate two very different social issues. And this is where I also agree with Oren that the focus on poverty can be very misleading because there is a social phenomena, a sociological phenomena we call poverty. It often is associated with substance abuse issues, mental health issues, criminal records. There's all kinds of forces that affect why there is this about 1% of the population that can work but isn't. And they require different kinds of services. They do genuinely require kind of wraparound support quite often. And one of the reasons I favor having a child allowance be basically universal is both to symbolize this is about family per se and not about poverty per se, but then also to build a platform to which all families belong, where we don't have this tiered system where middle-class families receive a simple tax credit and lower income families are triaged into programs that are meant for that sliver of the population when in fact we're conflating two different issues. And this is really important when it comes to the topic of income shocks, because one of the largest income shocks a family will face is childbirth itself. Household income falls about 10% on average around the birth of a child, doesn't recover for 6 months. Often the income that is being shocked in the first place is quite low because the parents are young. And this is a real problem. This is one of the reasons why I think a bipartisan approach to the credit that preserved some amount of full refundability would be wise to focus on the youngest kids, because these are the households with small infant children, where there is both much larger expenses, forces that are pulling down your market income because you're home caring for a child, and also some of the biggest returns to society. There is a brand new study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that uses the birth timing quirk for claiming the EITC, where if you're born on December 31st, you can get the entire EITC for that year. And so they look at families before and after that January 1st cutoff and identify that families that were born just on that side of the calendar year get about $1,300 more, and those kids end up growing up to have higher earnings, higher test scores, higher graduation rates, and generate more tax revenue for the federal government that pays for that expenditure. And that's a pretty remarkable effect. And one of the reasons they think that the effect is so large is because that money is well timed to what they call the liquidity event of having a child and getting those early resources when they're most needed. And I think this has become especially relevant given the SCOTUS news and all the debates around having a broadly pro-life agenda that goes above and beyond just sticks and starts looking at carrots.
Okay. So staying with that idea specifically, this idea that what Oren alluded to earlier, where he said, well, look, if you think about families that don't have any income and you give them a bit of money, they're still in poverty. But Scott, you have looked at this through a different lens. When examining poverty reducing features, specifically of the CTC, you have said the following: it is difficult to explain why intergenerational mobility out of poverty has failed to increase over the past half century, even as the official child poverty rate is at an all-time low and has fallen from over 20% in the early 1960s. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial to understand. Sort of to get back to this kind of framing that Elaine raised at the very beginning. Among people who support expanding the child tax credit into a sort of child allowance, you often get the impression that there's a belief there that sort of what matters above all is reducing today's poverty rate, minimizing today's poverty rate. And the way you do that is to give government cash to families without conditions. And I think just both of those premises are entirely wrong. If it were the case that reducing poverty was the thing that increased upward mobility for poor kids, which is ultimately the thing that I care about. If you start at the bottom, can you make it out of the bottom as an adult? Can you make it to the middle class? Can you make it even higher? Since 1962, research by Rich Burkhauser, Kevin Corinth, and some others has shown that if you sort of rigorously apply the same poverty line over time and keep the definition of income consistent and comprehensive, then yeah, the poverty rate falls from about 20% in 1962 to about 5%, under 5% today. Now, if you think, how could the poverty rate be 5%? The official rate's much higher than that. If you start with the official poverty rate, then in 1970, 70% of the population lived under that equivalent line, which is about 10% in 2018. So there's just been a massive decline in poverty. Poverty among single parents and the children of single parents is at an all-time low. And it's been dramatic declines over time. We've managed to do this even without a child allowance or an expanded child tax credit. Over those same decades, we've made no progress increasing upward mobility out of the bottom fifth. If anything, it's perhaps gone down a little bit. Now that suggests to me that the kinds of solutions that reduce today's poverty are not the same solutions as those that would increase upward mobility when kids get into adulthood. And so that raises the question of what else can you do besides just giving cash to families. And here, I think the point of caring about work and caring about single parenthood is not to punish kids for the choices their parents make. It's because we should care about kids and we should care about their upward mobility. And to the extent that things like having a parent that doesn't work or growing up with a single parent and without your father impedes upward mobility, then caring about poor kids means caring about how we reduce poverty and doing it in ways that increase upward mobility, doing it in ways that don't have the risk of unintended consequences that just giving cash will give to people. There's great research out there showing that up to 1.5 million people over the long term would have stopped working if the expanded child tax credit had remained permanent. That reverses a lot of the increase in work that happened after welfare reform in the 1990s, which, by the way, everybody thought was cruel and punishing parents. But in fact, it reduced the welfare rolls, it reduced poverty, it increased work among single mothers. And it was just an incredibly successful policy experiment that reduced poverty, and soon we'll know whether it also increased upward mobility or not. The kids, 1996 are getting to a point where we can start looking at their outcomes. And there's a paper, for instance, that finds that food insecurity among adults who were exposed to welfare reform is lower than for kids who weren't exposed to it. One last thing, how we reduce poverty, another way that matters, Sam alluded to this new study on the EITC, which is a really interesting study, but that's a study of families who were working. And some of them were on one side of a threshold and got the EITC, and some of them were not and didn't. And it shows that the additional cash from the EITC, which is a program that encourages work, produced all of these benefits for kids. It's not right to sort of think that we can just translate those results to a program that includes work disincentives like the expanded child tax credit would have.
Well, it's important to remember that when you're applying it's retroactive. You can't be incentivized into work.
That's not the point.
But
the point is it's like
the
a
study is very
randomized
careful about trying
where
to isolate the effects through conventional regression techniques. But I just want to comment on that because the study that Scott mentions, where this 1.5 million figure comes from, it kind of beggars belief. This is 2.6% of all working parents. are stipulated to only be working because of the child tax credit. If you dig into how that study was performed, again, it is one of these microsimulation studies where you assume a can opener and you get a can opener, but it contains many very dubious assumptions about the participation elasticities that parents face. In particular, it treats households as a unit and judges the labor market decisions of both parents simultaneously. And so you end up kind of inflating the effect. And I think it's really important to look at the empirics above and beyond just plugging data into models. The child tax credit was expanded in 2021. Scott will say maybe it needs to be long-term for these effects to show up, but not only did we not see a drop in labor force participation, when it expired, we saw a drop in labor force participation from the expiration. And that's because many low-income families were relying on the credit to afford childcare. And we have that both through interviews and anecdotal data, but also from large empirical studies that look at how low-income households, and especially single mothers, actually use child benefits. And at the very earliest stage, it's to actually afford childcare, often through relatives. And from the social mobility perspective, that can be really important because that is the thing that gets them into work. Now, what Scott would rather have is those people be filtered in through TANF and assigned to a means-tested childcare subsidy that ends up trapping them in poverty longer term because of benefit cliffs. And I think actually, when you think about it carefully, this debate between cash versus social mobility really is a false dichotomy. Moving to a more universal system can involve cash, but also involve greater social mobility simultaneously.
So I think the paper that Scott is alluding to is Kevin Coordinate's paper with Bruce Meyer, Derek Wu, Mike Stednicki. I think there were some questions about the substitution effects and the strength of those effects, and we have actually Kevin on later on today. We'll talk about that at length. But Scott,
I'm going to just respond real quick.
Go ahead, please, by all means.
A couple things. The idea that conservatives who are worried about work disincentives would have expected that a program that started sending monthly checks in July and that stopped in December with an uncertain fate after that's going to incentivize anybody to stop working, at risk of losing their job and not being able to go back to it, is patently ridiculous. And it sort of either reveals a complete misunderstanding of the research that people who favor the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit expansion cite, or it signals an indifference to that research in a sort of framing that doesn't involve a seriousness about the issue. And the research that Corinth and Meyer have done, I'll let Kevin defend it this afternoon, but it is completely consistent with decades of reviews about the strength of the work disincentive in the earned income tax credit. And what Kevin and Bruce have shown is that if you believe that work incentive exists for the earned income tax credit, as most supporters of the child tax credit do, you have to believe that changing from a child tax credit that has a phase-in to a child allowance that does not has the same, except in the opposite direction, impact on work. Until someone explains why that work effect is different for one and not the other, than sort of waving your hands at a study and sort of citing a poll that was done last fall about a benefit that was going away in a few months, just does not seriously refute the research.
So we've started talking about work and the need for work. So Elaine, recently you gave an interview in which you said the following. You said, with regards to the CTC specifically, when we think about the CTC in the context of work, whether a person works or not is not a function solely of whether or not there is a CTC. Individual characteristics matter when it comes to labor force participation. Could you talk about that?
Right, so I think Sam was getting at some of this earlier. Your disability status matters, whether you're a parent matters. Do you have childcare that's safe and affordable available to you? That matters. What's your skill set? Does it match the labor market you're in? So there's a whole host of questions come in. I think it's fair to say these questions change as the underlying labor market changes, opportunities change. So, there's always room for new results and new thinking. I have a paper that's coming out in a couple days that I'll scoop just a little bit, where we looked at two groups of people in December of 2020 and December of 2021. And we have people who received the child tax credit and people who did not. So to sort of answer a little bit what Oren was pointing out earlier, did it make a meaningful difference? Yes, we see food insecurity drop amongst people who receive the credit. We also see fewer difficulties paying for housing. The second thing we see, though, is that there's no real difference in changes in the labor market for people who are receiving that credit and people who are not. They're both returning to work. If the child tax credit really had this really powerful pull, then I would expect you to see people who are receiving it to hold out a little bit longer before they went back to work. And we don't observe that in the data. That's the Wellbeing and Basic Needs Survey that the Urban Institute Health Policy Center runs sort of on a regular basis. So I think the story is big, it's complicated. There's also, you know, other estimates out there of how many people would drop out of the labor market. There's no doubt that some people, when they receive the benefit, will work less or not work. The survey data tend to suggest, and this is work by Leah Hamilton and others, that it's people who are in married couples, and we've seen that with the EITC as well. A secondary earner might work a little bit less. And also sort of what Sam was talking about earlier, parents of very young children. And so we might actually consider it a good thing when some folks sit out a little bit longer or work a little bit less.
I mean, I will say slightly in Scott's defense, I know he's been very clear about sort of distinguishing between reduced labor force participation on the intensive versus on the extensive margin. Scott, and my sense is that I think the broader concern is reductions in labor force participation on the extensive margin. Is that correct? Just people just dropping out of the labor force in totality as compared to just reducing the number of hours people are working. Is that a fair assessment?
I'm potentially worried about both. I think the research is focused on the extensive margin, people just going from work to non-work or from non-work to work in the case of the earned income tax credit. But I think both are concerning, and the 1.5 million estimate is just people who will go from working to not working. It doesn't include people who will move from full-time to part-time work. But I think that can be concerning as well.
So just staying with the theme of work, Oren, last year you and your colleagues put out a plan. You call it the Family Income Supplemental Credit. That particular plan does call for a work requirement. You say, we argue that such a policy should not be understood as a child allowance, but rather a form of reciprocal social insurance paid only to working families.
Yeah, I think this goes to something Sam raised that I think was a really important point, which is that at the end of the day, when we're thinking about why do we want to get extra money to families with children, what is the role for government here? There's certainly kind of the anti-poverty safety net rationale, and we should discuss how our safety net should operate. But in terms of a broad-based child allowance, it seems to me that the core rationale for it is about these income shocks and income smoothing, that people have children at a time in their life when they've probably saved the least for it. It both reduces their earning capacity and raises their costs. And in a sense, in a perfect market system, you could buy some sort of product that would give you lots of money now and you'd pay it back later in life if you could. Of course, that doesn't actually exist. And so whereas it's fairly intuitive to think of Social Security as something we pay into now and then receive later, I think we essentially need the same thing, which is to say that for young families, there's something they are essentially going to have to receive now and pay into later. And so the question is, all right, how do you kind of construct that system and maintain a social compact in which people are contributors, not just recipients? And I think that's exactly why some form of work requirement makes sense. And what we propose in what we call the FISC is to try to have a very light work requirement and one that accounts for income shocks by just looking back a year at prior year's earnings and just say you can't receive more in child benefit than the total that you earned the year before. And so that's a very low threshold. That means someone working part-time at the minimum wage would qualify in most cases for a full benefit. It means someone who loses their job during the year still qualifies, and even qualifies the next year probably. It means that someone who has to leave the labor force because they're having a child still qualifies. But at the same time, it makes it clear that this program is not simply a form of welfare. It is actually intended to be a part of our social compact and something that expects productive contribution. And I think I just want to pick up briefly in this context on something everyone else has been speaking about, which is that you can do lots and lots of economic studies that claim that at the intensive versus the extensive margin, this design versus that design will cause this many 100,000 people to join the labor force or leave, or, and this is my point about you can claim that you're now above the poverty threshold versus below it. If you think about what actually drives poverty in the long run society-wide, it's much broader trends in terms of whether people are forming stable two-parent families in the first place, whether people are working versus dropping out of the labor force. And so I think economists sort of, look for their keys under the lamppost and focus on what their econometric models allow them to say. But the reality is that whether people whose kids were born on December 31st and get more cash do better than people whose kids were born on January 1st and get less cash, that's not the question. The question is, what is the broad structure of social expectations and public policy that is going to reinforce the sorts of norms and values that are going to direct people toward good decisions and provide a better context for raising kids? And I think that should be the point of departure for how we design any sort of child benefit. And if that's how we think about it, then I think insisting that there be some connection to work and that the recipients be engaged as productive members of the society has to be part of how we build it.
So I do want to leave some time for questions, but I did have one of my own for Scott, specifically with regards to the work requirement. Last year, you said the following. You said, and this was within the context of single parents specifically. You said, should single parents be expected to work, surely our safety nets must be soft-hearted and not so inflexible as to indiscriminately impose the same expectations on everyone receiving government support. Scott, that sounds like you're calling for a no work requirement.
That's because it's taken out of context.
Okay.
No, I mean, my point on that quote is that there are always going to be some categories of parents and families that we do need to shield from work requirements. Welfare reform in the 1990s, I think, was a fantastic example of that. In practice, it set out fractions of states' caseloads that were not subject to the work requirements that everybody else had. And in practice, very few people got kicked off of TANF rolls because they refused to work. And that was because the policy was such a success in reducing the number of families receiving welfare benefits that states actually got to count that towards the number of people that were meeting the work requirement. And so it shielded people that were not going to be successful if they were forced into the workplace. But what we discovered with welfare reform was that's a much smaller group than myself at the time. I opposed welfare reform at the time, but it's a much smaller group than people who are worried about work requirements think. When I wrote that sentence, I think I was talking about people who have severe developmental disabilities, for instance. People who have such extraordinary personal challenges that they're just not going to be able to maintain a job and essentially are going to have to be wards of the state. New mothers, we're not, we shouldn't send new mothers into the workforce, 2 weeks after they deliver, 2 months after they deliver. There are categories of people for whom work requirements, don't seem quite right, but that's a very small group of people. It's a much, much smaller group than I think a lot of folks on the left and people at Niskanen seem to believe. And all the arguments that they're making were the arguments that were made in 1995, 1996. And in the end, welfare reform passed. It included the carrots that Sam likes and that I like a lot. And because of the carrots and the sticks, poverty went down over time. And it never went back to the level that it was back then. That's a model for how we can reduce child poverty, hopefully increase upward mobility, which we've not been able to do.
Okay, well, I do.
Can I just say for the record that I think the welfare reform in the 90s was a necessary and important reform. I think the old AFDC program paid people not to work, and that was hugely problematic. So I think there's you can walk and chew gum. I think both welfare reform was important and useful, and a child allowance would be a step in the right direction. And that's because I don't think that these things are in conflict. I think policy debates have a tendency to reference historical landmarks. In Canada, when we had this debate, a lot of the references were to Quebec's failed provincial daycare program, which had huge detrimental consequences on kids. And when the Liberal Party was trying to nationalize daycare, the Conservatives enacted a child allowance as a more flexible alternative. And all those debates revolved around that historical touchstone. And I think one of the things that, agreeing with Oren that we need to move beyond is by breaking the frame of just thinking this is poverty, moving beyond these increasingly cliched historical moments.
Sam, do you think that removing a phase-in, a work incentive in the existing child tax credit and just giving the same amount to people whether they work or not is paying people not to work?
I think it is reducing the size of an active subsidy. I think one of the problems with the elasticities that Corinth and others have used is they're looking at estimates based on, well, they're taking the midpoint of an estimate that has a wide range. And part of that reason is because you're looking at a once in a generation event. The late 90s, we moved several million single mothers into the labor force. That doesn't happen twice, right? You can't do that twice. And when you run studies trying to extract what was the elasticity of the ITC in the late 90s, you will get high estimates because this was a group that had much more sensitive incentives to move into work. Today, labor force participation elasticities have probably declined, and we don't have this latent population sitting on the sidelines that's just begging to come in if we stop paying them not to work.
Speaking of a once in a generation event, we've been getting a few questions. I think the first one is for you, Elaine, specifically with regards to COVID-19. And the question is, do you believe that COVID-19 has made the CTC more or less important for families?
Can you repeat the end of that question?
Of course, yeah. The question is whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic has made provision of the CTC more or less important for families.
So when the policy was passed, we were in a big mess, and there was great need for broad support, and we had to look at the tools that were available. So they might not have been perfect tools, but the child tax credit was there. It was already delivering benefits to something like 90% of families with children, and so we could tweak it pretty importantly in big ways and deliver substantial assistance. So COVID was a very important time to provide subsidies. But what, sort of the thing you alluded to at the beginning, poverty was actually a problem for many families before the pandemic. It could have grown during the pandemic, but we kept it from doing that with all, relatively generous support programs. And it will remain a problem, once the pandemic is gone for some people. And I think we would want to work for those families. But I also think the child tax credit, because it does cover more than just very low income families, that's an important feature of it because, other families struggle too. I did some work for Health Affairs not too long ago, sort of reviewing the health literature. And, even when you, provide additional cash to middle income families, you get better health outcomes. And so the support and the need is still there. And, the policy context is constantly moving right now. Low income families are, feeling the heat from inflation. And I think the estimates for Moody's suggest they're paying about $300 more per month. And that's, shockingly close to the benefit of, one child with the child tax credit. And so we could be delivering that now, offsetting that issue.
We're almost out of time, but I just want to get through one more question that came in for Oren. What about the minority of individuals that are raising families, but due to unforeseen circumstances are unable to work? Should they receive a child benefit even if they are unable to contribute to this compact?
Well, I think a little bit to the point that both Sam and Scott have been making, it's important to try to define who exactly this group of folks is, right? If you have a household that truly has no income, is that because this is somebody who's still, a young parent still living with their parents and those parents are providing the support? Is that because you have someone living on past savings? Is that because you have someone purely supported by the safety net? I think what happens when you start to get down to what are essentially edge cases is you're likely to find vanishingly few where, well, obviously, if we sent them a $4,000 check, that would be a good way to address the problem is actually a plausible answer. And so exactly as Scott said, I think this thing I agree strongly with him on, we still need a safety net. I think we should strengthen the safety net. And to Sam's point about, especially very early in someone's life, if you do have, a young pregnant woman who doesn't have sources of income support or is, having a first child in very difficult circumstances, we need to find ways to provide a lot more resources and support to that person. And that will be good for them and their child and ultimately for the society. But that doesn't mean that the answer is just unconditional cash mailed out every month. And so it seems to me that when we're designing a program, the instinct on the left is to sort of sweep every edge case in and say, what's the most extreme situation we can think of? And let's make sure our program covers that too. And the reality is that that's not a good way to build strong, broad-based, widely supported programs. And I think things like Social Security are a good example of this. And we should focus on building a strong, broad-based, broadly supported program to support working families, which is what the child tax credit was and which we can build on. And then let's absolutely have a discussion about how best to help those edge cases. But let's not confuse the two discussions, because that's a recipe for stalemate. That's a recipe for the mess of the child tax credit expansion that the Biden administration created over the past year. And I don't think it's actually a plausible way toward effective reform.
Right on cue, Oren. Thank you so much. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much to all our for joining us. As I mentioned earlier at the start of the panel, we will upload the video to our R Street website. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact any of our panelists or myself. Thank you all so much. Yep.
Thank you.